So good morning everyone, or good afternoon, depending where in the region you are, and welcome to this OnRobot third virtual coffee chat. So today we'll be discussing the where and the what for starting automation or starting collaborative automation, especially for SMEs. So in the previous two sessions we discussed the why you would start collaborative automation and the when. So today is the where or the what, which is going to be really exciting. So please grab your favorite mug, get your favorite tea or coffee, and sit down and get comfortable and get ready to get started. So the first part today, I'm just going to go a step back, take a step back, and talk about what is collaborative actually, what is collaborative automation or collaborative applications, because I think I kind of missed that out. So some of you might be very new to this, which is understandable. So let me just briefly explain that first, and then I'm going to go into kind of the where and the what. So I'm going to talk about what sectors and industries might be good for automation or collaborative automation especially. I'm going to talk about the areas like in your factory or in your company would have be good to look at the automation process. I'll discuss some of these manual jobs that are done today that brings a lot of wear and tear to your employees that could be automated. And then ultimately I'll talk about these specific applications that might be good or easy even to start automating. So let's get started with the session today. So first of all, what does collaborative mean? So basically if you go to a dictionary, it'll basically say produced by or involving two or more parties working together. And that's really what collaborative is about. So when you talk about the collaborative space or the robotic space in general, of course we are mainly talking about cobots as a start, right? So robots and humans working together. So in case you're not familiar with the term, cobot basically means collaborative robot. Yeah, cobot. But of course there's more to it than just a cobot. So what does it take to be collaborative when it comes to a robot or to a collaborative applications? There are really two things mainly that are the key things. One is it has to be safe, right? Because we're talking about robots potentially very dangerous equipment working right next to humans, so it has to be safe. So that's really a key part of it. The other thing is it has to be very easy. So you go and talk about typical most industrial robots right these days. If you're as a new to automation need to start go in and try and do programming and set up for robots or industrial robots, it's really not that easy. You need help of a third party or a system integrator to do the setup for you, to do the programming for you. But with the cobots, you can easily learn how to do that yourself, even though you have no background in robotics. So these are the two things, safety and easiness. But I think there's also a third part which is really important, that makes a difference between the cobots and the industrial robots, which is flexibility. That you have the ability to work with different tools for different applications. You can move around your collaborative application from one part of the factory to another part very easily. So these are the three things that I think that makes a major difference between the industrial side and the collaborative side of automation or collaborative automation in general. So when it comes to cobot safety, typically relies on lightweight materials, rounded edges, so when the robot or the end effectors on it moves around, if it hits somebody, it's not going to cut you. Mostly there's a limitation on speed also and force also, because again when it hits somebody it shouldn't hurt or make damage to humans or even equipment around the robot setup. And often that is done with various types of sensors and software and so on. So when it comes to collaborative automation, there's really four types of automation we're talking about. The first one we call it coexistence. So that's basically where the human and the robot works alongside each other without a fence, but with no shared workspace. That is actually the most common type of collaborative application at the moment. The second one we call sequential collaboration, where the human and the robot, they're active in the same shared workspace, but their motions are sequential. So basically they do not work at the same part at the same time. So that is the second most common collaborative application setup that is in the industry today. The third one is cooperation, where the robot and the human work together on the same part at the same time, where both of them are in motion at the same time. It's not as common yet. I think it will be in the future, but yet not so common. And the last one is responsible collaboration, where the robot responds in real time to movement of the human worker. And now we're kind of going into things like AI and more sensors and this kind of thing. Very unusual still at the moment, but this is one of the things you will see a lot in the future. I also just want to very briefly just touch on some of the standards or specifications that are important when you're looking at automation and also collaborative automation. So here we're talking about our ISO standards, which are used globally. The first one is ISO 10218-1, which basically talks about the individual robot on itself, without any end effectors or anything else attached to the robot. So that gives you certain standards, what is important when you set up the robot itself. The next one is ISO 10218-2, which is kind of the whole system. So you have the robot, you have the end effectors, you have the robot cell, and whatever else sensors and so on you have as part of that cell. And then you have a specification, which is also ISO, but it's called CS 15066. So it's not a mandatory standard, but it gives you a guideline of how to do a risk assessment. It gives you a guideline, for instance, how much force can you have in a gripper, for instance, if you use grippers for your application. As an example, anything about 140 Newton with a gripper, if it has to be collaborative, is no longer collaborative. So if you have a gripper, it opens and closes, or closes mainly, right, with 200 Newton as an example, it is actually no longer collaborative, and you have to fence off that application. So these are some of the important things that you need to look at when you start looking into automation, and particularly collaborative automation. So let's now get to the topic of today: where and what would you really automate? Now, when it comes to industries, I'm getting a lot of questions from from SIs and end users and so on. What are the typical industries that are doing collaborative automation? I'm always trying to avoid that question, because I think it's not so much about industry, it's more about applications. So as an example, you can take pick and place, which is probably one of the most common applications you have out there using robots, right? So pick and place, you can use anything from a catering setup to a hospital, to a bank, to a greenhouse, to an automotive factory, for instance. So it doesn't really matter about the sector or the industry, it more matters about the application itself. That being said, if you look at the most common sectors or industries that are using automation in general, but also collaborative automation, of course the two big ones are the automotive industry and the electronics and semiconductor industries. That's really where the majority of automation is done at the moment. But it could be anything from pharmaceutical companies to food and beverage, warehousing. You have things like e-commerce right now, which is huge now, where you have many different products in different sizes and shapes. So you need a flexible system to be able to pick up these and put them in boxes and so on. If you talk about, I mentioned agriculture before. We have done a lot in banks, for instance, a lot in educational institutes, hospitals, healthcare, and so on. So there's really almost no industry and no sector you can't do automation, especially when you use electric products. For instance, OnRobot, everything we do is all electric, so you don't need to worry about having air support and pneumatics and systems and all this, which can be very noisy. It takes a long time to install, and it's basically not nice to have it if you have it, like say as an example, an R&D setup. So these are the typical sectors or industries where we see automation or collaborative automation at the moment. So what are the areas where you typically will start automating first within your company, right? So of course there's a big difference when you talk about a manufacturing company, or you're talking about agriculture or hospital or maybe a restaurant. But if you look at manufacturing, depending on what you're doing, but the first step you can look at is your laboratory or your R&D sector, right? So this could be, for instance, in food and beverage, or healthcare. A lot of R&D is done. Sometimes you have your staff handling maybe hundreds of samples every day. And now we're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of automation of those kind of handling of parts and samples that is now done with collaborative applications. So that's really a key step where you can already start looking at this kind of automation. Of course, the main part will be within your production area or manufacturing area. There's tons of tasks you can do, and it doesn't matter whether you're an SME or bigger company. It's more down to the kind of task you're doing. But a lot of tasks, especially in SMEs these days, are still handled manually, right? Which is not always very good, especially for your employees. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But it could also be moving, parts from your warehouse into your production area, or it could be moving parts from one process in your automation to another process, and they can be done, for instance, with AGVs, with robots on top. It moves around and pick up certain materials from one place, move it to another place, another process is done, picks it up again, moves it to a third process, or move it to a packaging area, for instance. So there's a lot of areas within your factory that you can look at it. Even your canteen or your kitchen, if you have that. If you're a big factory, you have a kitchen for your staff and so on. Next is hospitality. So we see a lot in kitchens. This could be, as I said, it could be in factories, it could be in restaurants, it could be in catering areas, it could be in hotels. This is already ongoing. And you also see it in cafes, for instance. I'm sure a lot of you either see it online or maybe in real life. You've seen, robotic bartenders, robotic baristas, things like that. Set up where you can have ice cream served, by robots. So it's really fun, it's really interesting. But these things are already ongoing now. So hospitality is a big sector as well, where you see the automation and especially collaborative automation happening at this moment. I mentioned earlier healthcare, already ongoing as well. One example is within pharmacies, where you have robots helping to dispatch medicine into different boxes and handing it over to a staff who ultimately puts it in a bag and give it to the client or the patient at the pharmacy. You also see it in operating rooms. That's a bit more, let's say, high-end automation, but it's already happening with proper sensors, with proper vision systems, where you can actually operate on people using robots and certain equipment to do it from afar. So these things are also already in place. But this is not it. I mean, that many other places, as I said, we've done it in greenhouses, we've done it in banks, a lot in the educational sector and so on. So there's a lot of areas where you can already automate now, which I would say with ease, actually, without having, needing a big engineering department to help you, or using, maybe even using integrators to do, tons of hours of work, to set up, to build equipment, to do the programming and all that. A lot of it can be done by just your own staff with limited knowledge. So what are some of these manual tasks that are done by humans today that maybe, well, they can be automated, but also creates a lot of wear and tear on your staff? So one is lifting empty pallets. It could be from a warehouse to an area where you do the palletizing yourself, putting boxes on the pallets. This is actually still done manually, so you have, it could be one human or maybe even two humans lifting quite heavy and bulky pallets, dragging them from one area to another area. And this is typically very bad for your back, but it could also be bad for your wrist and so on. So that's one area that takes a lot of wear and tear on staff today already. Another thing is doing screw driving, which is a common application in many companies, where for your wrist you have that constant screwing movement. So again, very bad for your wrist, and I'm sure for those of you that are doing them manually, I'm sure you have seen, some of your workers complaining about complaining about the pain in their wrist and so on, or maybe even have to go on sick leave, which of course is not ultimate for neither you nor the employee. It could also be things like gluing and grouting with epoxy, or other type of harming substances. So this could be, one could be body wear, where you use the same motion all the time, but it could also be the risk of poisoning, so people basically inhaling, poisonous substances, which obviously is not good either. So these are the first three. Number 4 would be, say, uncomfortable working positions, where for some reason you have to move in a weird position to do some sort of application, to do some sort of job task. So you can have wear and tear on both your body, but also maybe on your arms or your wrist, depending on what the position is. So that's a very common type of job where you also see a wear and tear on your employees. Another is, and this is a little bit related, is welding of hard to reach areas. Again, this is a similar thing where maybe you have to bend down and you have to reach in somewhere and do welding, because there's not enough space for you to do it otherwise, where you twist your back and so on. So again, that's a common application or a common task where you see wear and tear on your staff. Another thing is repeated, very monotone movements or micro movements. It could be moving products onto an assembly line. You do the same all the time, or from an assembly line into a box or similar. So you have these movements or micro movements, which again, it could be wear and tear of your shoulders, your elbows, your wrist, and so on, but maybe also your back. But it is also shown, studies also shown that not only physical wear, these kind of jobs can actually lead to mental stress as well, which obviously is not good for your staff, and certainly won't make happy staff for sure. Another thing which maybe some companies won't really think about or consider is simple thing as driving with pallet staplers in a warehouse or in a production area where you might have a bit of uneven floor. So imagine we're not talking about forklifts here, just these electric pallet staplers where you are standing behind, moving around, maybe lifting up pallets and so on. So if there's uneven floors, you might have these kind of movements which are really, really bad for your knees, or very bad wear and tear on your knees. So consider this as well if you have employees doing this and your flooring is maybe getting a bit old and a bit uneven. Another thing you have is surface finishing, so things like polishing and sanding. You could have a lot of vibration for one example, which also could hurt your arms, your elbows, your shoulders, your wrist, and so on. But especially for sanding, it could be also a bit dust. Maybe you have a proper vacuum system, maybe you don't. And also wearing mask all day long is really not comfortable. So things like that you can also automate easily. And the last one is kind of just working in dusty and dirty environments. It can cause breathing problems for your staff. It can cause allergies depending on what kind of dust or material they're working around. So these are 9 very common jobs or tasks that are done today manually, which is actually very easy to automate already. So talking about the applications now, right? So talking about these applications which are easy to automate based on these kind of jobs. So we look at assembly, which is one. You can automate your screw driving also with collaborative setup, completely collaborative as well, so you don't need any fencing off. That's actually quite easy to do as well. And you can also do it with the gluing, right? So you can use it. You can do it with cameras. You can do it with sensors and so on. But there's gluing systems and cobots that can easily work together and do the gluing job for you, and even move the products onto the area where you do the gluing and move it as well, move it off as well into another area without staff having to lift heavy or potentially heavy equipment as well. So that's the first type of assembly you can do collaborative applications. The next one is surface finishing. I mentioned sanding, polishing. You can do deburring as well. So again, with the use of things like sensors, like cameras, and things like that, even specific sanding, polishing tools, collaborative tools, you can very easily automate these things, and these are really very tiring and wear and tear jobs for employees doing this kind of jobs nowadays. So look into this as well as one of these areas where you can easily automate it. Machine sending is another area where you have part feeding. It can be moving products onto the bins and from the bins into the machine. This is probably one of the most common applications that are now used with collaborative applications today. So you can use it with a single gripper, you can use it with dual grippers to increase the cycle time. But again, this is one of these things that are actually very simple to automate, but again with a very high ROI. And you know, when you install these kind of things, I mentioned this in a previous session, just consider that you can basically do this, you know, you can automate, so you have, you can run 24/7, you know, with these collaborative automation with the users of very few people. So there's a big saving there, and again, also your employees will not be have a lot of wear and tear on their bodies, because all these kind of repetitive jobs tasks are now done by robots. Material handling is probably one of the most common things we're talking about here, like, you know, pick and place, especially, you know, moving items from one area to another area, or packaging, or taking items and putting them into a box. Again, very repetitive tasks, which are very bad for the body, or for your arms and your elbows and your shoulders and so on. So very, very easy in most cases to automate these kind of tasks. Another thing which is for many industries, not least in automotive and electronics and so on, is testing and inspection, which can be done with the robot, again with visions or sensors and software, or a mix of these three. Again, it's often quite easy to automate these kind of things, especially with collaborative automation. I talked a little bit about packaging already, but packaging and palletizing, you know, that could be anything from moving the empty pallets onto the area where you want to do the palletizing, moving the boxes from assembly line onto the pallet, and ultimately moving the pallet into, for instance, a warehouse. All these things can be automated fairly easily these days. There's lots of different robots and grippers and AGVs and sensors and so on, and software that helps you do this without much complication. And the last one is dispensing, so things like gluing, adhesion. It could be sealing, it could be soldering. It's also very often are done manually these days, not least in this area, you know, where Southeast Asia and so on. So this is the last sort of this, let's say, a very standard type of application where you can really go in and automate with collaborative application. So that was kind of the last of today's session. I hope you have learned something new, especially if you're considering to start with automation, but you're not really sure which areas to start with or what kind of applications to do. So these first three sessions, I talked about the why. Why do you want to automate? When is the right time to start automating? And today, the where and the what. And then in the next session, which is going to be maybe even more interesting, I think, is the how. How do you start? And I think we are probably going to be a bit more, go into a bit more details and show a few examples how, for instance, OnRobot can help you with that automation process. So again, I hope you have enjoyed this session. Please start subscribing to our social media platforms. You can start by clicking subscribe to our OnRobot YouTube channel where this is shown. And then please stay tuned. We are going to go to the Q&A session now. Thank you. All right, thanks. and we're now ready for the Q&A. And I was just handed a few questions for some of you who sent it on the private chat, so thank you for that. But please keep on sending questions if you have any. So the questions I have so far, the first one is it possible to lend equipment if you want to test an application we are considering to automate? Certainly, yes. You definitely can from OnRobot, but as I think I mentioned in a previous virtual coffee chat as well, is that the way OnRobot works is that we work through what we call partners around the region. So they are the one who will be supporting you directly in your specific country and location with help from OnRobot. As an example, if you want to test a full setup with a robot, which we are not selling, our partners would have access to the robot, and we can lend them one of the OnRobot end effectors if you don't have it already, and we can help you test it if you need a proof of concept or something. So for sure, reach out to us, and we can arrange for that if that has your interest and your need. Another question: what is the most popular collaborative robot in the market? Well, that's a good question. If popular and most sold is the same, then for sure the new universal robot cobot is the most popular. It has about 50% market share at the moment. I think I'm not quite up to date on the statistics, but that is for sure the most sold cobot in the market so far. A few others are things like Techman and Doosan as well, I think, which is number 2 and 3 or somewhere around that time. But I think it's ultimately down to what you find the easiest and what you find most suitable for your application in terms of payload and arm length and so on. So reach out to some of our partners and they can discuss that with you as well if you're looking at the cobots right now. Then I have another question: can OnRobot also integrate with industrial robots or only with cobots? So yes, we can. For most of our products anyway, basically integrate with any robot. It doesn't matter what robot brand it is. It could be 6-axis, it could be light industrial robot, cobots, it could be SCARA robots, and so on. We have a way of integrating with it. Again, I'm not going to go into too much details here, but please reach out to us and we can for sure connect with one of our partners or set up a test if you want to try that out. But it's possible? Absolutely, yes. Then I have another question. How do we know if a gripper is collaborative? Okay, so the beginning of this session, I was talking about certain standards and specifications, ISO standards, right? So if you go to the one I mentioned, ISO CS 15066, which is a specification, so it's not mandatory, but basically it guides you on what you should look out for if you want to have a fully collaborative automation, including a risk assessment and so on. As an example, talking about gripper, for instance. Here is the OnRobot ID6 gripper. So one of the things you're looking at with collaborative end effectors, the same with the cobots as well, for instance. If you will see this, it's all very round shape. There's no sharp edges and so on. So you imagine this gripper moving around with the robot and it hits you somewhere. It will not cut you, as an example, right? So that's very important. For OnRobot, for these grippers, you also have these safety shields, which come standard with our grippers. So basically means you cannot get your finger inside here, which some other grippers are not having. So imagine you get your finger in here and it closes with full force. It might not feel collaborative anymore. It might not break your finger, but I guarantee you it probably won't feel very nice. So these are also things that it's important. Now, you might not be able to see it here, but for this particular gripper for OnRobot, we have safety shields here as well. Same thing, if it closes fully here, and for instance, your finger in between, as soon as it touches one of these buttons, it will cut off. So these are some of the things you have to look out for. I mentioned also at the beginning when I talked about 15066, if you have a gripper closing with more than 140 Newton, it's no longer considered collaborative, right? So you actually need to fence off your whole application. So look at 15066, it will give you a lot of guideline on what to look for in terms of having a collaborative application, not just a collaborative gripper, right? Because the thing is, having a cobot with a non-collaborative gripper, as an example, is not collaborative and you need to fence it off. So look at 15066, it will give you that kind of guideline on what you need to look out for. I think that was the last I had of the questions for now. Are we having any other questions? I think we have another question.
Yeah, so we have one question from Y Xiaodong. Any access to framework on grippers for research and academic use?
I'm not sure what you mean by framework, but now you're asking, we're actually having a webinar for the educational sector on the 5th of August. So check out for that on our LinkedIn and so on. But we are offering educational pricing if you are a university or an educational institution that are looking at buying end effectors. So that much I can say, but again, you need to talk to one of our partners because that's how we sell. We don't sell directly. So you can contact us directly and we can put you in contact with them. Or if you know one of them, please contact them directly. And they can help you with the pricing for what end effector you're looking for. So I hope that answers your question. Any other questions we have? I think that's about it. Do we have any more? No. Okay, no more questions. So again, thank you for joining in for this virtual coffee chat session. Again, we have one more in this session, where the first again was the why, the second was the when, today was the where or the what, and the last one will be the how. So as I said in the beginning, the final session we'll go a bit more into to a bit more technical details. We'll probably show a few different applications of how easy it is to actually set up a collaborative application for things like maybe a bigger place, a policing, or something like that. So stay tuned, subscribe to our YouTube channel, our LinkedIn, and so on, so you can follow when and where things are coming up. Again, thank you for joining, and see you soon again.